Once upon a time, there lived a very beautiful girl whose beauty was second to none. Her name was Chizoba, and she was by far the most beautiful girl in the village. Although many admired her beauty, no one wanted to be in her shoes. In their village, it is an abomination to marry or have any form of relationship with people from the neighboring village. This was because, according to history, the two villages were formed by two brothers who fell out and migrated to set up their own separate villages. Anyone who dared to marry or have any form of relationship with a person from the neighboring village would be seen as an abomination and ostracized by the villagers. What this means is that no one would ever marry such a person or any of their descendants. Chizoba's ordeal began many years before she was born. Her mother, Obi, fell in love with a man who pretended to come from her village. His name was Kanayo, and she met him one hot afternoon by the village stream. Kanayo never informed Obi that he was from the neighboring village. They spent time together and made the stream their meeting point. Chizoba's mother, Obi, was deeply in love with Kanayo and soon fell pregnant for him. It was then that her whole world began to crumble before her eyes. Obi informed Kanayo of the pregnancy and he denied her, saying that he could not father a child with a woman from the neighboring village. Obi's eyes shone in shock as she never knew that Kanayo was from the neighboring village. Kanayo then abandoned Obi, leaving her clueless on what to do. The news soon spread around the village that Chizoba's mother, Obi, committed an abomination and the people began to avoid her like a plague. Even her own family disowned her as they feared being segregated by the members of their village. Obi suffered and struggled with her pregnancy alone. She later gave birth to Chizoba, who was a beauty to behold. She never heard from Kanayo or his family and lived her newfound life looking after her beautiful daughter alone. After so many years, Chizoba grew into an extremely beautiful woman. Her mates were now getting married, but Chizoba had no hope of finding love as no man dared to speak to her, talk more of asking for her hand in marriage. Whenever people saw her on the road, they would call her wasted beauty, and this always hurt Chizoba, who began to question her entire existence. One hot afternoon, Chizoba got fed up of everything that had been happening. She wandered into the evil forest, which was home to the village ancestors. Chizoba was so desperate as she could no longer bear the horrible life of solitude her mother and herself had been subjected to for a very long time. When Chizoba got into the evil forest, she met a man who asked why her heart was heavy. Chizoba explained everything to the man, who smiled and gave her a weirdly shaped stone. The man told Chizoba to give the stone to the king and that she should say to the king that that which ought to be done should be done. Chizoba, confused at what the man was saying, looked up to ask him a question when suddenly he disappeared. Filled with fear, Chizoba ran out of the evil forest, wielding the stone. She rushed home to her mother, who dissuaded her from going to the king. The mother feared that harm would befall her daughter if she delivered such a message to the king. For days, Chizoba kept the stone in her room. Whenever she went to bed, she saw the man in her dreams, asking her why she had refused to deliver his message. This went on for days, till Chizoba summoned the courage to approach the king. She got to the king's palace and requested an audience with the king. While she was waiting, the crown prince of the village emerged and saw her standing in the corner. Her beauty captured his heart and he approached Chizoba to ask her name. "Chizoba, my name is Chizoba," she replied the prince as she stuttered. The prince smiled and continued on his way. Chizoba's heart raced as the prince was the first man in the village who had asked for her name and even smiled at her. When word got to the king that Chizoba wanted to see him, he was furious as he had warned her never to come to his palace again. The king rushed out in anger, and when he approached Chizoba, she stretched forth her hands towards the king, who saw the stone in her hands. "Where did you get this from?" the king asked Chizoba with a shock on his face. Chizoba replied the king, saying that a man in the evil forest gave her the stone, saying that she should deliver it to the king and that she should also tell the king that that which ought to be done should be done. The king looked at Chizoba in shock as he walked back into his throne room, wielding the stone in his hands. The king was confused and sent out his guards to hurriedly fetch the chief priest of the village. When the chief priest arrived, he met the king looking troubled. "My king, what troubles you?" the chief priest asked the king, who showed him the stone. "My king, is that not the stone of succession?" the chief priest asked the king, who revealed that Chizoba delivered the stone to him a few minutes ago. "Abomination," the chief priest said in disbelief. "How can a child born in abomination be the chosen one?" The chief priest shook his head as he stared at the king in shock. The king then said to the chief priest that that which ought to be done needs to be done, and the chief priest nodded in agreement. Chizoba, however, returned home bemused. She was troubled as she had no idea what was going on. That same night, Chizoba was home with her mother when the king's guards surrounded their hut, saying her presence was needed at the king's palace. Her mother cringed in fear as she began to cry. Several terrifying thoughts crossed her mind as she fell to the ground crying. The king's guards took Chizoba to the king's palace and locked her up in a room. After a few minutes, some maidens came in with fresh clothes and oil. Chizoba asked the maidens what they were doing, and they replied that they were preparing her for the ceremony. "What ceremony?" Chizoba asked, and the maidens kept mute. Chizoba then began to scream at the top of her voice, requesting for someone to come explain to her what was going on. She screamed for a few minutes till the queen of the village walked into the room to calm her down. The queen revealed to Chizoba that they were about to perform the compatibility ritual, as Chizoba was chosen by the gods to marry the prince of the village. Chizoba's jaw dropped as she could not understand what the queen was talking about. "How can I be chosen to marry the prince when the whole village knows that I am an abomination?" Chizoba asked the queen, who replied her saying that the gods cannot be confused. The queen revealed to Chizoba that the stone she presented to the king earlier that day was the stone of succession, which the gods only gave to those that they had chosen to marry the crown prince. The king and everyone in the palace were confused as to why the gods had chosen Chizoba of all people in the village to marry the crown prince of their village. The king then requested that the compatibility ritual be carried out to ascertain if truly Chizoba had no blood ties with any member of the neighboring village whom they were prohibited from marrying. With the compatibility ritual, Chizoba would be locked up alone in an old hut stationed in the evil forest. Her hands and legs would be tied with an enchanted rope which she would be unable to untie by herself, as only the gods can untie the enchanted rope. If by morning Chizoba comes out with her hands and legs untied, then they would know truly that she was a freeborn, free to marry any man from their village. But if by morning Chizoba was found still tied up in the hut, this would signify that she was not a freeborn and would be unable to marry from their village, as she had ties with the neighboring village. Chizoba, on hearing this, began to panic, as she knew that she was not a freeborn. The fear of being tied up in a hut alone in the forest creeped her out, so she pleaded with the queen to send for her mother, who was all alone at home at the time. When Chizoba's mother arrived and heard what was happening, she pleaded with the king to please let her daughter go, as she knew that her daughter was not a freeborn. The king, however, told Chizoba's mother that this had to be done, as Chizoba had been chosen by the gods to marry his son, the crown prince. The guards then escorted Chizoba to the hut in the forest that night and tied her up with the enchanted rope. They left her all alone in the forest, and by morning, when they came to check on Chizoba, they noticed that the rope had been untied. Their eyes shone in amazement as they took her back to the king's palace. Even her mother Obi could not understand what was going on. The chief priest then decided to consult the gods one more time, and the gods revealed that their village and the neighboring village were not formed by two brothers. The gods revealed that the reason why their two founding fathers fell out several centuries ago was because they found out that they were not brothers. So they decided to separate their families and settle in different places. They, however, told no one about this, and that had led to a tradition which had discriminated against Chizoba and her mother and several other people for so many years. Chizoba and her mother could not believe their ears. They bursted out in tears, as this tradition had cost them a lot. The king then apologized to Chizoba and her mother, as he felt so bitter for ostracizing them unjustly. They both forgave the king, and the king sent his guards to announce to the villagers that the crown prince was getting married. All the maidens in the village were shocked, as they wondered who the crown prince was getting married to. The prince was, however, excited, as he fell in love with Chizoba the first day that he laid his eyes on her in the palace. Chizoba too was in love with the prince and could not wait to be his wife. She could not believe that she would be getting married, not just to any man in the village, but the crown prince and heir apparent to the throne. On the day of the prince's wedding, everyone gathered to see the woman the prince chose to be his bride. To their greatest amazement, the prince unveiled Chizoba as his bride, and the whole village was in complete shock. They could not believe their eyes and began to murmur in disbelief. The king then stepped forward to announce the abolishment of the long-standing tradition that restricted members of their village from getting married to people from the neighboring village. The king then went on to pronounce that Chizoba and her mother were free from all discrimination, and from that day on, no one ever discriminated against them again. The people then began to intermarry with people from the neighboring village, and that was how the long-standing and evil tradition was abolished. The lesson to be learned from this story is that oftentimes traditions and beliefs are rooted in misunderstandings and misinformation. It is therefore essential to question and re-evaluate these customs when they lead to discrimination or harm. The story also teaches us to be bold and courageous, as being courageous can often lead to unexpected outcomes. And finally, always remember that the truth will always prevail. It might take time, but in the end, the truth will always find a way of coming to light. I hope you enjoyed the story. Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It helps us grow our channel. I'll see you in our next story. Bye.